Hello and welcome to this interview as part of Restaurant and Bar Design Week. I'm Harry McKinley and I'm joined by Bryan O'Sullivan, founder and creative director of the London-based Bryan O'Sullivan Studio. Today we're going to be discussing the Berkeley Bar and Terrace, a landmark project for the studio that last year won Best Overall UK Bar at the Restaurant and Bar Design Awards. Quite a feat for the studio's first hotel bar project in London. During the awards, I said this: the Berkeley has long been the cool, esoteric choice of West London hotels, embodying a kind of design-led bohemia. Ultra-fashionable and rooted in art, culture, and a celebration of all things artisan. The brief for Bryan O'Sullivan's studio, then, was to bring an intimate, contemporary bar to the hotel, one that would, presumably, rival the other famed habitats within. Now, today, I think we can all agree that it's been highly successful on that front. So, let's dive right in, Bryan. This project has picked up every design gong going. So as much as I can call it a signature project from the outside looking in, does it also feel that way for you? Was this in some way a turning point?
Hi, Harry. Thank you very much for having me today to chat about the Berkeley Bar. The Berkeley Bar does feel like a turning point for the studio, I feel. It was one of the first projects we designed probably every element of the bar, so down to the furniture, the lighting. So it was a 100% bespoke sort of offering and kind of from A to Z designed by the studio. So, and I guess we were experimenting with a sort of a more minimal style. It was slightly curvier, slightly more textured, but an overall kind of light and uplifting feel to the whole space. So it definitely pushed us forward design-wise. And I feel it sort of set us apart a little bit where we were, I guess we're looking more to interior designers in Paris and maybe in maybe some in New York that we're kind of being referenced by, and then looking back as well, obviously, to older designers. But I feel it's a more sort of cutting edge end result, which kind of moving away from the sort of pastiche kind of Victoriana style restaurants, which there's been a lot of in the past. But we were kind of thinking it's nice to go more clean, more fresh, more contemporary, really, I think. So in that sense, I think we definitely were moving out of our comfort zone and sort of trying something new.
And there is something about these big London hotel projects that tend to thrust design studios into the spotlight. So even though Bryan O'Sullivan's studio was quite established before, certainly in residential design, and you had worked on other hotels, was there a sense that taking on this project created a lot more attention around the studio?
Definitely. I feel hospitality projects are definitely more visible, and I suppose there is a need for the client really to get it out there and get publicity. So I mean, we're lucky. The Mayborne are an incredible team to work with, and they have an amazing PR machine behind them. So they were really on top of the getting it out there, and we obviously worked very closely with them on it, but they have an amazing team behind it, so they were really able to sort of push the product. So yeah, and I think it definitely has catapulted us in the most incredible way. Like, we have an office in New York as well, and that on the back of this has gotten super busy as well. So it's been incredible, and kind of on the back of it as well, we have a lot more projects coming up. I think we have 10 or more projects on with Mayborne now in across their different hotels, and so they're an incredible client. They're really, and I feel we've got a really good yin and yang with the client. We get his vision, but it's also a very collaborative process. So he's very involved, and I think we get his vision and he gets our vision. So it works really nicely together, I think.
So let's take it back to the very beginning then. How did the whole thing come about? I think you were actually having dinner at the time.
Yeah, it was. We were in Chateau Lacoste. James, my husband, his family are friends with Paddy McKillen, actually, so that's how it actually came about. So had dinner with him down in Chateau Lacoste, and we just kind of got chatting about design. And I used to work for a lady in New York, an architect called Annabelle Seldorf, and Paddy is a huge fan of hers. She designs a lot of art galleries and cultural spaces. And Paddy is a big art collector and very into design. So I think that was one of the kind of the bonding points I think we started chatting about. And then I was telling him we have a studio, and then he was saying, oh, I've got it initially was going to be a cigar bar project in the Berkeley, and he was saying, would we be interested in having a look at it for him? That he had been chatting to a few designers, but he wasn't sure they were quite getting the brief of what he wanted and kind of striking the balance. So we knew, obviously, Paddy would be an incredible client to get on board. So we went all out. We did full-on photorealistic CGIs for the first meeting. I think we may have had one meeting where he discussed what he was thinking, and then we came back then with like CGIs, material palettes. And Paddy said he would normally go through a few iterations of the design with designers. Luckily, he said he was 100% behind what we had proposed, and he said, let's go for it. And actually what's built today is exactly the design we proposed. I think there was very few tweaks to it from initial concept right through to completion. So it was one of those things where the kind of the stars align, and you kind of, and you're on form, and you kind of know you have a vision, and it sort of comes together super quick. It's not always, they don't always come together that quickly, but this one for some reason just everything kind of worked in straight off. So it was great.
So you've now left behind the glamour of the south of France. You're back in London. It's probably raining. And the reality of getting to grips with the project kicks in. You mentioned that they were initially thinking of doing a cigar bar, for example. But what was that first brief?
So the brief was, obviously there is the Blue Bar, which is like an incredibly famous bar by David Collins. It was one of his signature bars. So obviously we had huge shoes to fill, a big act to follow. So Paddy didn't want anything to compete with the Blue Bar, obviously, but he just wanted a second offering. I guess he wanted a glamorous bar where you can go for a drink. Obviously there was a Terrace there as well. The Terrace is a stunning setting where it's looking across at the church on Wilton Place. So it's a beautiful room. It has really big windows. It previously was a bar that he was never quite happy with how it was. It was a similar layout. You came in, the bar was in the same place. We added the fireplace on the other end, and we sort of broke up the layout. But Paddy's brief basically was a secondary bar. Initially, he was thinking it would be a cigar bar, but then once we got a little further, the mechanical requirements for the air filtration system to actually have it as a bar you can smoke inside is quite challenging. But subsequently, we were actually working in a cigar shop for Paddy on another project, which I'm not allowed to mention fully yet, but it's coming soon, where we have managed to figure out the filtration system on the floor and the ceiling. But I think then it developed more into a whiskey bar, I think was the brief. I think we like the idea of keeping it quite light, and I guess the word is gender neutral, as opposed to, it's not masculine, it's not feminine. Traditionally, whiskey bars are quite heavy, quite leather clad walls, dark woods. I think we wanted to move away from that because that's sort of the obvious choice, I think. So we wanted it to be a bit more uplifting, fresh, a bit more cutting edge, and to really feel like work with a lot of artisans and craftspeople to really get the sense of quality and design when you walk into the space, so that it doesn't just feel like, it feels special. I think that's what we wanted to do, was feel like a special, glamorous place that you can come into and have a pre-dinner cocktail or a drink on the terrace.
At the very beginning then, before you've even produced a single CGI, where did your mind go first? What did you percolate on in terms of what your response to the brief would be, and what you would be looking at in terms of design references?
A rule we have in the studio now is that we try to avoid Pinterest, or I feel everyone is being fed the same algorithms. So for inspiration now, we kind of as a rule say, obviously you need to kind of keep up with trends and see what's happening. But I think if you use it as a point of inspiration, everyone is doing the same thing. So you need to kind of, we have quite a big library here in the studio of older architects from the 20s, 30s, 40s, a lot of French and Italian architects and interior designers. So I guess that was our starting point. We went through some old books. We wanted it to feel, I guess it was more 1940s glamorous is what we were kind of looking at. They were more classical references, but then with a modern twist, I guess is how we were looking at it. So architecturally, we were looking at kind of Carlo Scarpa. We were looking at, and then we were looking at Jules Lelou, Joseph Frank, lots of different designers for inspiration then for the furniture. And then I guess it evolved a little bit then. We spoke to Longpre, who are the joiners we use quite often. So they did the wood paneling for us. So we wanted something kind of special for the walnut paneling. And they happened to have just bought a 300-year-old walnut tree, which had naturally fallen. They wanted to stress the point that it was naturally blown down and it wasn't felled. They showed us some of the figuring from these veneers and they were stunning. So we thought that would be perfect, and it had a really nice story then. So we wrapped the whole bar in this walnut paneling. So that was originally in our pitch to Paddy, and then we were showing like a plaster relief at high level, and then later that evolved into, we decided there was such a nice story about this 300-year-old walnut tree that we thought then to tell the story of the tree in the plaster relief that kind of wrapped the frieze that wrapped around the bar as well. So it's a kind of a subtle reference to the history of the tree basically, and also all of the wood. So the bases of the stool and the waiter stations in the room are all made from the same. So all the wood in the room is all from this one tree. So we thought it was a nice way to celebrate the life of the tree. So that was a big element as well in the finishes and our kind of influence for the design.
The Blue Bar, which you mentioned before, at the same hotel, of course, is quite an iconic space. Did what was done there factor into your thinking at all? Were you conscious that the two would have to sit tooth by jowl?
Previously, in the past, when I was just out of university, I used to work for David Collins. I started as an intern, and I think I used to work during the summers while I was at university, and then went back and worked for a while. But I knew, and I obviously still hold David in the highest regard. I think he was such a talented designer. But I think I learned a lot from David in the fact that he also had this incredible physical library so had a really good knowledge of the architects and designers that had gone before, and would reference different elements from different periods of different designers. And I think it gives you a much stronger design language if you kind of understand what's gone before you and use those references as opposed to looking at what are the current references on Pinterest. But so I guess the way we approached it, I think, was definitely influenced by the way David approached his projects. We knew the standard of workmanship and detailing that went into the Blue Bar, and we knew we had to try and be as good, at least in our bar. So there was a bit of pressure there.
Well, of course, we're talking about a hotel here that has a pretty keen design sensibility anyway, but it is still a hotel, and it can be challenging for designers sometimes to navigate the bureaucracy that goes hand in hand with that. Did you have something of a free rein, or did you feel that there were pretty clear limits on where you could take it and what you could do?
I guess that's one great thing about working with Mayborne is, there's one clear boss, Paddy, who we worked very closely with on the project. And it's one thing that worked really well, is that we seem to align in our visions for the space. And generally, I think we have a similar design aesthetic, and he really gets what we do, and we really try and achieve what he wants. So I think that works really well. But every space has to work. It can be the most beautiful space in the world, but if it doesn't work functionally, it's useless. So we did work very closely with Knut Wild, who's the hotel manager, and the bar managers as well. In terms of the bar layout, for example, it was quite it's a horseshoe-shaped bar, but it's quite a tight space, so you can just about fit two barmen behind the bar. So it has to be really well designed and planned and laid out. The hotel also have very good kitchen consultants as well, so they're on board quite early, and they're advising on where where your cutting station is, where your ice station is. So it was like almost like yacht design in the fact that like or small space design, where you have to, every little tiny bit of space has to be utilized and has to make sense. So we definitely had a close dialogue with the hotel team to make sure waiter stations in the right place, to even down to table heights, seat heights, to make sure that it's correct. Because obviously it's not full on dining, but they'll have snacks and cocktails. So it all needs to, and there needs to be enough space on the table to fit the olive bowl, the snacks, like if there's 4 cocktails and the coasters. And so all that has to be thought about. So we did have initially we worked with Paddy to get the overall look and feel. And then it's working with the hotel team to make sure everything is that they need, is all the boxes are ticked.
To dig a bit more then into the detail of the design, there is a little bit of a period feel. It's a bit deco, and I can almost imagine Noel Coward propped up at the bar. But it also feels highly contemporary, especially in some of the furniture forms and the colour palette. Was that tension between the past and present something that you consciously cultivated?
Definitely. I think our references were definitely 1930s, 40s, 50s. So we started off with that, but we wanted it to feel like a current, and we really wanted it to push forward, and I think overall to have a kind of a contemporary, clean look and sort of break away from these sort of ye old world inspired interiors. And I feel we wanted to be a bit cleaner and a bit more, again, looking forward, looking to kind of what's more current, what's 21st. And that was also a brief from Paddy as well. He really wanted it to, he said we should be looking forward, not back, and it should reflect the time that we're in right now. So I think it was marrying the two, this sort of these older influences for the furniture and the textures, but then I think the architecture was probably more curvy and more contemporary, and then it was trying to kind of, how do you marry the two? And I guess then if some of our furniture, then there's the armchair we did was a kind of very curvy, kind of voluptuous shape. So it was a nice mixture of, some pieces were a little bit more mid-century inspired, and then some were definitely more, but I feel the overall mix of these two and kind of marrying it together gave it a really nice sort of end result.
Thinking of colour, it does almost go back to what you said at the beginning about creating a space that doesn't feel too gendered, if we want to put it that way. And it is a really beautiful, sensitive colour story. Can you talk me through that and how you struck upon that palette?
I guess it probably, generally, it's kind of a rule on projects I find, is I like to have the overall feel when you go in to be, unless you're intentionally trying to create a different vibe, that it should be uplifting and almost happy and not down and depressing. I think it's always a nicer vibe in a space to make it feel more uplifting. So that was our starting point. A big helping factor to that was having these really big windows flooding the space with natural light. So that also really helped. And I guess the other point to mention was that the snug, which was a room that originally was a cloakroom, and when the builders knocked the back wall in the cloakroom, we found out that there was all this extra space. So then we came up with the idea that it could be a really great snug. And we did a bit of research into, like, traditionally how the snug was. It was traditionally in old pubs where the women they were sort of banished to the snug, where they wouldn't bother the men who were in the main bar. So we kind of were interested in that concept. So we kind of wanted to turn it a bit on its head. So the snug became the sort of most glamorous, fabulous part of the bar, so that it's more elevated. So it's the place you would really want to be. So it's almost celebrating femininity. And then I think that carried through to the mural then. So the mural was kind of more female faces. So we worked with an artist called T.M. Davey, who, it was again celebrating kind of the female form. And the colours then I guess that we had already been looking at colour palettes, but then T.M. Davey incorporated these kind of lighter corals and pinks and light blues, and we didn't want it to feel over feminine either, or over masculine. It was sort of, again, it was sort of like gender neutral space, I think you could kind of call it. But we did want the snug to kind of celebrate femininity, basically. So, and I think that carried through then the colours throughout the bar. So it was all these sort of lighter, more uplifting, pastel-y colours.
And the snug is absolutely fantastic. It's this alcove imbued with so much charm and drama. It's got its own sound system, its own doors, and of course the T.M. Davy mural that you mentioned before. But it can be quite difficult to bring an interesting design and creative sensibility to what is a very small space. So what were some of the considerations there?
Paddy had the idea that it should be a space where some of their more, I don't want to say famous, but famous is the word I'm thinking. Some of these more famous clients can come and be more anonymous. So I think that was the idea why we put the pocket doors that are also made in the same walnut, but they can be closed over, and the clients could then, or the customers can use the space privately, but still kind of be linked to the bar, but they have their own area, but they can also then play their own music, and there's a button where they can call for service as well. There was definitely some M&E issues with trying to get air conditioning in. There was some pipe work at the back that we needed to work around. Sometimes it's a curse to have these things that you have to work on, but then sometimes you can end up working around these things that it ends up making the design more interesting, because it ends up creating a more interesting space on plan. So there was definitely a few things we needed to tweak and incorporate into the design and work around. I think it worked really well. It's not as tight as you think when you're in there, and you could comfortably sit about 9 people, and you can have almost two conversation groups if you want in the room as well, because it's kind of like a right side and a left side. So we've gone there once or twice for drinks as well, and it actually works really nicely as a snug. Normally the doors are left open so that you still can kind of see what's happening, but it's nice that you do have the option to close off the doors for privacy.
And why a New York-based muralist?
So we work quite closely with a gallery in New York called David's Warner Gallery. There's an amazing lady there called Andrea Cashman that we work with, and she actually recommended to us. She was like, there's this really cool up-and-coming artist called T.M. Davy. She's like, you should check him out. And then that's how the conversation started. So I think Paddy always likes to push. I mean, art is a huge thing. He owned Chateau Lacoste, which I think every top contemporary artist in the world has a piece of sculpture there or a piece of art, and so Paddy really likes to push the boundary on art, and I think he was very keen to use someone who's up and coming. It makes it all feel a little bit more kind of cutting edge. So I think it was just by accident that we happened to come across him, and we showed his work to Paddy, and Paddy thought it was incredible. So he came over and did the mural for us.
It almost also goes without saying that materiality is terrific. It's sumptuous but not fussy, and there's a real sense that one's eye always has something to feast upon without feeling overwhelmed. There's marble, wood from that 300-year-old tree, beautiful decorative glass. How did you approach the project from a materials perspective?
We started looking at the walnut was one of the first elements that we started looking at, and we obviously came across that tree, so we were really interested, and they had a really dense figuring on the grain, so I think that's what really attracted us to that. Then I think we liked the idea of bringing it to 3/4 height and working with this plaster relief above, so then that developed into telling the story then of the tree. There was a fireplace at the end of the third room. It was a long rectangular room, so we tried to break it into 3 separate rooms so that it gives you a nice quality where you're in these rooms, you feel like you're a little bit protected. So I think it makes having a cocktail experience more enjoyable if you can see what's going on, but you kind of have these little areas that make you feel a little cozier and a little bit more protected, and just breaks up the room. So we have these sort of columns that come out on either side to create these, but there's a little vision panel or a little gap sort of in between the wall and the column, so you kind of get this nice little glimpse to the other areas. You can still see what's going on. put the fireplace at the end of the room, created this nice access going from the bar all the way through to the fireplace. I guess that's something we try to do wherever we can on projects, is create a symmetry and an access line, depending on the project and depending what it is. But it creates these quite striking views then, kind of, we find. So we created this kind of corridor from the bar to the fireplace on this axis, and that became this kind of pink coral marble, which we felt tied in with the kind of the color scheme. And then on these thresholds where the room is divided into these sort of three chambers, we inserted these kind of swirly marble inlay thresholds that were kind of inspired by, we were looking at Osvaldo Bersani, an Italian architect. Kind of a lot of his work was in the 50s and 40s, 50s and 60s as well. So we were really interested in these little inlay swirls that kind of, again, reinforced the playfulness and the kind of curviness that we were trying to look at as well in the architecture. And then we worked with Galerie Duren, who are a French carpet company. So we worked with them for these carpets that are then inlaid in the seating areas. So they're kind of off the marble corridor, let's say. And they had a range of carpets actually that were inspired by aerial photographs of rivers and terrains, so that if you look at it, then you can kind of see almost like if you're looking at the estuary of a river, and you can see where the silt has been deposited. And we thought it was nice to bring in more of a natural inspired texture, and it also brought in an element of luxury as well. So you have this marble corridor, and then you kind of step into your area where you're going to sit down, and it's carpet, so it's warmer, and it's also helping with the acoustics in the bar as well, but also feels quite luxurious. There's a Belgian blue stone, which is black, bar top on the counter, and then carved limestone on the bar front as well. So it's playing with lots of natural materials. And then I think the wall lights we designed have handmade glass. The ones either side of the bar have these cylinders and handmade bubble glass as well. So as much as possible, natural materials, and quite calm and soft, with a few accents of black metal and black stone to kind of balance it out. Our overall material palette was meant to be quite, again, soft and uplifting and textured where possible.
So you created that corridor that runs through the space, and you mentioned previously some of the spatial planning that you considered. You must have had an idea of how people would navigate and enjoy the space. And now that you've been back many times yourself and it's been open for some time, is it how you imagined? Are people using the space as you imagined that they would?
Yeah, and I think it's quite successful in the fact that you have almost these four pockets, really, of they're like four clusters of seating. And going back and say, I think people always go for the ones by the fireplace initially, so they kind of, and then the two areas a little bit closer get filled up next. We also designed these two standing tables that are opposite the bar, that we sort of did a dome of sort of walnut burr, and then it has this inset table, so they're slightly higher so that you can stand. And the idea was when all those seating areas are full, that you still have two really kind of desirable, obviously they're not going to be as desirable as the seating areas, they're going to get filled up first, but we wanted these two areas to feel super glamorous still. And so by creating this sort of walnut burr dome and this inset table, which has this sort of tree-like base that kind of comes up and meets the stone top, and we designed these little brass, almost like desk lamps that sit on each table. So it still feels like a very special space that you're standing at, and you don't feel like you're shortchanged that you didn't get the armchair. And then obviously the snug, people love the snug, so they sort of all kind of gravitate towards that as well. So, and then obviously the terrace then as well, we initially didn't fill it with so much furniture, but because it was, the hotel came back saying it was super popular, so we had to redesign the furniture to make it a little more dense on the terrace so that they could basically fit more people, because they initially thought they only really wanted 2 or 3 little clusters. So we ended up doing a banquette that wraps around the terrace and then kind of fitting in more tables. So that was a tweak to the original design. But all in all, I think it seems to work really well as a space.
More than just responding to a brief, what do you think this project says about Bryan O'Sullivan's studio and your DNA as a designer?
I think it says a lot about the studio. I mean, all our projects, we're quite collaborative in the studio as well. While it's my name over the door, it's input from a lot of people. And we try to involve everybody, and everyone who's going to be working on the project, we try and involve everybody on the brainstorm, down to like the juniors, because everyone can have good ideas, and it's the more ideas you get on the table, the better. So I think it's a really good example of a project where we've had lots of heads together, brainstorm, have a lot of brainstorms, and get it to a point where we all have contributed and we all feel really happy with where it's gone. And I think it was one of the first projects we really brought a lot of people on board for it, and we felt it had a really good end result. So it's a new way we work in the studio now, where when we get a new project in, we try and get as many heads together, all brainstorm, come up with ideas, have a second one and a third one. And it's a very collaborative way of working, but there's always a better end result, I think, when you put more heads. Was it 2 heads is better than 1? Or so I think the more people you can get on board, the better. But it definitely, I think, says a lot about the studio in the fact that we definitely pushed the boat out. We try to do something different from what everyone else is doing at the moment. Try and bring it into the 21st century, looking backwards, but definitely looking forwards, and just trying to do something that's not cut and paste from what everyone else is doing. We have a lot of new projects coming up with Mayborne and with other clients as well, but we kind of feel they've all started to move that direction as well. So we're excited to show the next batch of projects that are coming up.
How did this project influence the projects that have come after it? Has it shaped your process and your work?
Definitely. I think we're being a lot more adventurous, especially on our furniture design. I think we're really pushing the boat. We have a really great furniture design team in the studio, and they're constantly experimenting with new curves and shapes, and it can be to the detriment of some of our suppliers, because sometimes they're like, we don't know how we can build this. And then we kind of obviously brainstorm with them a lot, and then we'll eventually get to a point where everyone's happy with it and we can get it into production. But I think it's got us thinking about things differently, and we've also been working on a furniture line, which we're hoping to launch in spring now. I think we're still trying to, it's very much on the lines of what we did in the Berkeley bar, but we're kind of pushing it further and further. So it's quite contemporary, quite curvy, quite fun, but it's also referencing back to designers that have gone before as well. So it's a nice sort of hybrid of the two sort of languages. But I think the Berkeley bar has really helped us we realized that people really liked this aesthetic, so we're going for it kind of on that. And it's helped us push the language of the studio's work more in that direction as well. I think traditionally we would have been maybe a little more classical but pared back, but I think now we're playing with it more, and it's becoming a little more playful, a little more fun, but then also serious at times as well. So,
well, thank you so much for joining us today, Bryan. You can find Bryan O'Sullivan's studio on Instagram at BOS Studio, me on Instagram at Harry McKinley, and Restaurant and Bar Design Awards at Restaurant and Bar Design Awards, as well as more content on the website at www.restaurantandbardesignawards.com. So do check out some of the other talks, and for now, thanks for listening.